Hey there, welcome to my comprehensive Moon Reaper guide. I'll be covering various things, from basic info, skill rotations, engravings, and so on. Although this guide is meant for Moon Reapers, I'm sure it'll be helpful for Thirst Reapers as well. Surely. Reapers have three types of skills: dagger skills, shadow skills, and assault skills. Or swoop skill, I guess. Dagger skills, or green skills, have short cooldown and have access to Reaper synergy on the first tripod roll. These skills generate identity gauge, but are negligible in terms of damage, especially so for a Moon Reaper. Shadow skills, or purple skills, have longer cooldowns and are generally utility based. Just like dagger skills, they generate identity gauge. Assault skills, or red skills, are the heavy hitters. They do the most damage and have the highest dagger out of the Reaper skill set. These are your main DPS skills, regardless of if you're Moon or Thirst. Unlike the other two types of skills, these skills do not generate meter at all. There are two tiers to Reaper's identity gauge: the Darkness gauge and the Chaos gauge. Darkness gauge gradually fills up over time. Landing a dagger or shadow skill on an enemy increases your gauge as well. Even basic attacks contribute to your gauge. When your darkness gauge fills up, you can enter the persona state. You basically do a backstep as you enter stealth. At the same time, a shadow clone is summoned, and you start gaining stacks that increases the damage of the next assault skill by 25%, up to 5 stacks. On top of that, you gain a 30% movement speed bonus while in persona state. Performing any action or running out of the gauge breaks the Reaper out of persona state. The shadow clone attacks nearby enemies, or simply follows you around if there are none. Enemies will actually lose aggro on your character and target the clone instead. You can command your clone to move to a location by using the shift key. This, however, will not cancel the clone's current action. Oh, and they phase through enemies, because why not? If you choose not to enter the persona state, a secondary red gauge starts to fill up. Unlike the darkness gauge, this chaos gauge gradually decreases over time and can only be obtained by hitting an enemy with a dagger or shadow skill. You automatically enter the chaos state for 9 seconds once your chaos gauge fills up. While in this state, you get a 15% critical rate along with a 10% attack and movement speed buff. The duration of chaos state can be refreshed by either hitting an enemy with a dagger skill or by simply using a shadow skill. You can still enter the persona state at any given time, but you lose the chaos buff immediately. Once the duration runs out, you lose all your chaos gauge but retain the darkness gauge. The specialization stat increases the damage of all assault skills. Just for reference, these are some values of other classes. It also increases the recovery rate of the darkness gauge. Reaper has one of the lowest defense coefficients in the game, alongside classes like Gunslingers and Deadeyes. This makes her extremely squishy, and it doesn't help that her skill kit is mostly melee, and she has a ton of displacement skills. If you're not careful, you get hit a lot. This is probably the most asked question. What is the difference between Moon and Thirst? Which does more damage? What should I play? Oh, Moon, of course. There's a Moon guide, man. Just kidding. But before we look at the differences, let's take a look at what's similar. Well, first, they both use assault skills. Assault skill is still your main DPS source. Second, they're both entropy users. This means you need to do back attack regardless of being Moon or Thirst. The Moon sound engraving removes the damage stacking mechanism in the Persona state, allowing you to use an assault skill immediately. Moon Reaper's playstyle is basically filling up the darkness gauge, going stealth, and then using an assault skill. Since the engraving significantly increases the damage of assault skills, Moon Reapers must go full specialization, with the secondary stat from Necklace being either crit or swift. The Thirst engraving increases the recovery rate of the Chaos gauge and grants an attack power buff while in Chaos state. Thirst Reapers have what you call a piano playstyle, spamming assault skills as they come off cooldown. For stats, they generally go for a 1-1 split on specialization and swiftness. There are some other variants as well, such as full swift or high swift. Here's a brief comparison between the two builds. Firstly, survivability. Thirst is definitely a clear winner here. You are pretty much capped out of attack and movement speed when playing as Thirst. You also have lower cooldowns compared to Moon, so your mobility skills will be up more often. Moon Reapers are required to use all their skills off cooldown to generate gauge. This is why it's way easier to survive on Thirst. Next, Stagger. The Reapers are really bad when it comes to Stagger, but Thirst still beats Moon nonetheless. Thirst is a piano class, meaning you get off your skills way more often compared to Moon, so they have far better continuous stagger. The extra assault skill on Thirst has really good stagger too, which means they win out on burst stagger as well. And because your cooldowns are short on Thirst, you are less punished for using your assault skills for stagger mechanics. Countering. For similar reasons to survivability, Thirst wins out here too. Because you have shorter cooldowns and faster animation speed, it's way easier for a Thirst Reaper to counter. You can always hold your counter for when you actually need it, unlike a certain other build. So at this point you might be like, hold up, isn't Thirst just better in every regard? Surely Moon is better in some ways, right? Oh yes, and that's the damage ceiling. Moon has slightly higher damage ceiling compared to Thirst. But how high are we talking? Well, in Trixian it's about 5% or so. But we all know Trixian DPS doesn't mean jack in an actual raid setting. But yes, theoretically Moon does have a higher damage ceiling. But you need to always remember though, higher ceiling doesn't necessarily mean better consistency. In many cases, Thirst can perform just as well, or even better than Moon. In short, Moon is considered a more selfish DPS that provides less to the team in exchange for a higher damage ceiling. So why should you play Moon? Well, if you dislike piano playstyle and prefer seeing higher numbers, then Moon is probably for you. Most importantly though, you should be playing Moon because you enjoy the playstyle. It is one of the flashiest and most satisfying gameplay in the whole of Lost Ark. At least for me. So in this section, I'll be going through the Reaper skills in detail. I'll be covering things such as stagger value, super armor, and some other neat tricks for each skill. The stagger value I used here is the number of pixels from the stagger bar, and the benchmark value to compare it with would be Whirlwind Grenade's value, which is about 80 to 81. Just keep that in mind. I won't be covering every single skill, but only skills that are relevant to Moon Reapers. Nightmare's synergy and poison is only applied on the initial hit, and not on the follow-up hit. The follow-up cast has push immunity, and CC immunity. The initial dagger throw is a counter, as well as the follow-up hit as long as you have the back attack tripod. The range indicator will persist even if the boss disappears. The poison and synergy effect is only applied on the second hit. Using the skill reduces the cooldown of all assault skills, as long as you have the assault activation tripod. It's also bloody good for maintaining adrenaline stacks. The stagger and identity gain increases if you're not using the shadow after image tripod. Just like Spirit Catch, not using the shadow after image tripod increases your gauge gain and stagger value. Distortion has multiple hits, allowing you to use runes like Bleed effectively. Shadow Storm is changed from a holding to a normal skill with the Shadow Zone tripod. The tripod on the second row can either be Quick Prep or Period. Quick Prep effectively reduces the cooldown by 1.3 seconds. Period simply increases the damage dealt. On the second tripod roll, you either take Tenacity for push immunity or Fog Explosion for more gauge generation. The Spreading Fog tripod provides more gauge generation, as well as the ability to phase through bosses. On use, Shadow Trap reduces the cooldown of all shadow skills. When used together with Distortion, it can be used to counter from the back, just like Nightmare. The back step from the skill can be used in various ways. For example, you can reposition yourself to get to the back more easily. Last Gravity phases through bosses that does not have collision. It also has the highest dagger value, just above a Whirlwind Grenade. Because Dance of Fury has a higher critical rate, it is generally better to use against enemies without a back, such as Vicus' tentacles. The initial hit of Cadenza fills up your darkness gauge immediately, your darkness gauge is full, it'll fill up the chaos gauge instead. Requiem's weak point destruction is applied on every slash. The super armor is applied on the initial usage, as well as the extra slashes. This is the most standard skill set for a Moon Reaper. Shadow Trap is a flex skill, meaning you can swap it out for either Spinning Dagger if you need more stagger, or Spirit Catch if you need extra weak point. In general, I prefer Shadow Trap because it gives you an extra counter and it reduces the cooldown of all shadow skill. There's another build based around Black Mist, which aims to improve the DPS ceiling by increasing the DPS cycle speed. This build generates more gauge at a faster rate, but you give up all form of versatility in the form of Nightmare. So this means no more flashy teleporting and no more back counters. On top of that, you're locked into using Shadow Trap, because the cooldown reduction on the shadow skill is necessary. I would only recommend this build if you know what you're doing, and if you're prepared to sacrifice all your utility for a slightly higher damage ceiling. So skill rotation on a Moon Reaper is fairly straightforward. What you aim to do is you fill up your darkness gauge, and then you wanna go stealth, and then use an assault skill. So notice that we have 3 red skills, and this is typical for a Moon Reaper. When I say one rotation, it generally means filling up the gauge once, and then using one red skill. And once you do 3 of these rotations, I generally like to call that one cycle. The Moon Reaper is all about maximizing speed in which you gain your gauge, so that you can get off your red skills as much as possible. The first rotation would be Shadow Storm into Shadow Dot, which would look something like this. And then you would follow it up by one of your red skill. So your next rotation would be Nightmare into Distortion, and then Nightmare back into Shadow Dot, and then finally Shadow Trap. And then you follow with your second red skill. So your third rotation here would be Shadow Dot into Nightmare, into Distortion, into Nightmare back, and then Shadow Dot. Notice how the third rotation, you don't exactly fill up your gauge, because you might lack either Wealth Runes or you might lack Speciality. This is why for a third rotation, you need to get off basic attack in between your Shadow Dot usage, for example. Like such. So that's all there is to Moon Reapers. You just need to rotate all your gauge as fast as possible and get off your red assault skills as much as possible. But obviously in an actual scenario, you might not be able to get it off in this order. So there are only a couple of things you need to remember. First of all, Nightmare and Distortion is pretty much used together. Just like this. This is because Nightmare doesn't have any super armor when you cast it. Only on the extra cast there's a super armor, right? So by using it as an opener like this, you risk yourself getting cancelled. Because any attack from the boss will cancel your cast and you might not get it off. So this is why if you do it in this manner, it's very safe. But there are cases where you want to throw Nightmare out first, like if you're countering or if you're approaching the boss and want to get to the back ASAP. In this case, you wouldn't use it in conjunction. This is why Moon Reaper, you don't really have a set rotation. It's more about how you adapt in the fight. And another general rule of thumb is you wanna use Shadow Storm plus any one skill only because that fills up all your gauge. So for example, Shadow Storm, Shadow Dot, that fills up a gauge. Shadow Storm, Nightmare will fill it up as well. Even Shadow Storm into Shadow Trap will fill it up. And Shadow Storm into Distortion. So you can see that Shadow Storm is very versatile. You can use it with any of your other skills to fill up your gauge immediately. But you generally want to avoid doing Shadow Storm into Shadow Trap because this will mess with your next cycle. But you can still adapt to it because in a real raid scenario, missing 1 or 2 seconds of cooldown isn't really a big deal. So other than that, it's pretty much up to you how you want to combine your skills to fill up your gauge. But just don't do things like, overfilling your gauge. For example, you're at like 70%, right? You don't want to use Shadow Storm here, because that's a waste. This is the only thing you have to keep in mind. You want to try to fill up your gauge without going overboard on your generation. So here's an example of 2 full cycles without using an awakening skill. Regardless of being Spec Crit or Spec Swift, these 4 engravings are your baseline engravings. For the 5th engraving, Spec Crit uses Cursed Doll, whereas Spec Swift uses Adrenaline. Now you may look at this and think, hey, why are we getting Keen Blunt with Entropy? Isn't that bad? Shouldn't we use Cursed Doll instead of Keen Blunt on Spec Swift build? Well, first of all, we have to establish that we're using Adrenaline 3, which means Cursed Doll is actually at a 15.1% damage increase efficiency and not 16%. Next, we need to find out a critical rate in which Keen Blunt weapon will give us more than 15.1% damage increase even with Entropy set. So in this calculation, I used Entropy level 2 as the baseline setting. So from this, we can see that we need at least 78.9% crit rate for Keen Blunt weapon to be on par with Cursed Doll. So the final step is to check if we can hit this crit rate, given our engravings and our set effect. And it turns out, we are way over the requirement. We're even past the level 3 entropy requirement. And this is why Spec Swift Moon Reapers always prefer Keen Blunt weapon over Cursed Doll. Moon Reapers only need 3 damage gems, 1 for each assault skill, and then 8 cooldown gems on the remaining skills. When upgrading gems, you always want to go for 3 damage gems first. Your last priority should be the 3 cooldown gems on your assault skills. This is because they are gated by your gauge generation in the first place, so having lower cooldown on them doesn't really help you much. In fact, you could probably leave those 3 gems at level 7, and you'll still have no problem with your rotations. For runes, you want to put Galewind on all your assault skills, and then Wealth runes on the rest of your skills. Your highest grade Wealth rune should be on Shadow Dot, simply because it is used the most within your rotations. The most important thing about your Wealth rune setup is being able to do the rotations mentioned prior. As long as you can pull that off, it doesn't really matter which Wealth rune goes where. In the future, when you get more specialization, you can start removing wealth runes to add in runes like bleed. So, how much does red skills actually do in terms of damage? What is the actual percentage of the total damage dealt? For a Moonreaper's case, calculating the individual DPS on each skill is meaningless. The skills are all rotation based, so we have to calculate the damage percentage based on the used skills. Done the calculation for both Spec Swift and Spec Crit, as they slightly vary due to the different engravings that they use. Note that for this calculation, I've used 1700 specialization, along with level 2 entropy as the baseline. Also, it is assumed that every single skill lands a back attack. The damage cycle used in my calculation is this specific setup. So from this, you can see that the 3 assault skills count for well over 90% of the damage dealt. This is why you only need 3 damage gems on our Moonreaper. You also notice that Rage Spear is the hardest hitting skill. Blast Gravity is technically stronger than Dance of Fury, but this is only the case if your critical rate approaches 100%. Without any crit synergy, Dance of Fury would be slightly stronger. To play Spec Crit or Spec Swift? That is always the question. So when looking at the numbers, Spec Crit obviously looks like a winner. It has 16% damage from Cursed Doll, over 6% from Adrenaline. So isn't Spec Crit always just better? Why would you ever play Spec Swift, you might ask? So Swiftness provides attack speed and cooldown reduction. This means you get in extra rotation compared to the Spec Crit build. This is why the damage difference isn't as high as you'd think it would be. Now let's take a look. At full level 7 gem, the Swift build allows you to get off 4 cycles within a minute. In contrast, the Crit build only allows you to get off 3 cycles and 2 rotations. And then when we're looking at level 10 gems, Swift build allows you to get 4 cycles and an extra rotation, while the Crit build allows you to get 4 cycles. So after taking all of that into consideration, the final damage difference ends up to be around 2 to 2.5%. Spec Crit does have a higher damage ceiling, but on the other hand, Spec Swift provides you with more consistency, and therefore in an actual raid setting, damage difference is almost negligible. On top of that, Spec Swift does not use Cursed Doll, which means you can avoid the penalty. In short, I like to think Spec Swift as a halfway point between Spec Crit Moon and Thirst build, so you're slightly more survivable than a Spec Crit build and more consistent. I personally prefer a more fluid and fast playstyle, and that's why I always go Spec Swift instead of Spec Crit. I hope this video helped all you Reaper enjoyers out there. If you have any questions or want to know the math behind the calculations, feel free to ask in the comment below, or catch me when I'm live on Twitch. Thank you for watching, and always remember, stay clear of the floor.